Unless sending spells are currently unavailable in your area, you've probably heard a bit about Daggerheart, Critical Role's latest offering to tabletop role-playing games. Daggerheart is currently in a beta playtest phase, and so far I have seen a lot of mixed reviews. While I was tempted to jump right in and make a video like the day it dropped to, I don't know, get those stonks, I really wanted to give myself plenty of time to read the playtest manuscript and run a few games so that I could, I don't know, kind of settle into things and allow my thoughts to coalesce. I've now run 3 Daggerheart games, one of which you can actually watch here on the channel. Just be nice to me, it was my first time playing and I made a lot of mistakes. And while I still think there is a lot for me to delve into, I'm going to share today my first impressions of the system as it currently stands. Okay, so when I recorded this video, literally the next day, the playtest update dropped. So some of the rules that I talk about have been tweaked or changed a little bit. Okay. Let's keep going. Like a lot of critters who are checking out this game, I am approaching this as someone who has primarily played D&D and has primarily watched people like Critical Role play D&D. I think one important question for any new game is, what is this game trying to achieve? And why should I play this versus other fantasy tabletop games like Dungeons & Dragons, like Genesis, like Pathfinder, like 13th Age, and the other games which are listed as touchstones in the manuscript? Well, in the opening paragraphs, Daggerheart has this to say. It proclaims to be a heroic narrative-focused experience with combat as a prominent aspect of play, facilitating emotionally engaging, player-driven campaigns that are punctuated by exciting battles and harrowing challenges. Daggerheart is designed to provide the tools to tell a story that is both heartfelt and epic. Heartfelt and epic are definitely 2 words I would use to describe the campaigns of Critical Role, and it makes a lot of sense to me that this game would try and capture that feeling. But will it be successful? The main reason I'm really excited to try this game and maybe, you know, use it in place of my D&D game is that I do really love that more narrative forward focus and that character-centered kind of style of playing. And while you can absolutely do that with D&D, we've seen it, you know, many times, and many of us have experienced that, I think it's really exciting to try a game that is coming at it from that perspective first, rather than D&D, which sort of started more as like a war game combat system. I mean, it really is just mainly built for combat. So yeah, I'm excited to see if Daggerheart can pull off that, keeping that narrative character-led focus along with having some cool tactical combat. The lead writer of the game is Spencer Stark, who you may also know as the writer for games like Alice is Missing and of course Candela Obscura. Spencer has a very cinematic GM style, which is particularly apparent in his chapter of the Candela Obscura actual play that Critical Role put out, and it's clear that Daggerheart is attempting to encourage this style of play, where the GM almost acts as, like, I want to say like a director or even an editor of the scenes, you know, like cutting scenes off to jump forward to a new scene and adding drama when the scene calls for it. While I certainly would describe Critical Role as a heartfelt and epic game, this cinematic style I think is actually very different to the way Critical Role runs now, which sometimes, in my opinion, gets like painfully granular in following the characters through scenes, almost as if we're following the characters in real time. I'd say a good example of this sort of cinematic style, other than Spencer's Candela run, is Dimension 20. Brennan in particular is really good at getting us right to the action and kind of cutting off scenes that, you know, probably could go on for longer, but narratively it's like it's done and we can move on to the next thing. I don't think it's absolutely necessary to GM in this way to run Daggerheart, but it's clear that the game is being written and designed from that viewpoint. Personally, I'm a really big fan of it, but I think if you're going to pull off this style, you'll need to have players who trust you to be that director and editor. And I do wonder if Critical Role will struggle a little bit with this style if they're going to adopt it, because they are kind of the monarchs of, you know, wait, just like one more thing before moving on to a next scene. This interplay between narrative gameplay and tactical combat is something that I am very interested in as a person who loves that more freeform collaborative role-playing, as well as getting into the nitty-gritty of strategy in a combat scenario. The way Daggerheart links these 2 things are through the use of 2 primary resources: hope and fear. Anytime the players attempt to do something like make an attack, or I don't know, like scale a wall, or anything else with an uncertain outcome, they make an action roll. The player rolls 2d12, designating one of them as the hope die and one as the fear die. If the fear die is higher, the GM gains a fear token, and if the hope die is higher, then the player gains a hope token. These resource tokens are intended to power both the abilities of the heroes as well as the abilities of the adversaries, and are generated by the narrative powers of the dice rolls. When you roll with fear, it pushes forward consequences and and danger in the story, and when you roll with hope, it adds a lucky break or a moment of optimism for the heroes. The thing that I enjoy most about this addition of a mechanical resource to dice rolls is that it really forced me as the GM to consider what dice rolls were actually necessary and were going to result in some interesting consequences. Of course, in any game, we want to make sure that we are only calling for dice rolls when they are actually necessary and required, but I've certainly been guilty of just reflexively calling for an ability check on occasion and then realizing like, oh, maybe that actually wasn't necessary. Knowing that no matter which way the dice roll went, the players were either going to get a hope token or that I was going to get a fear token made me think twice about calling for a dice roll and what the actual consequences would be for success or failure. And speaking of consequences, let's look at what actually happens after making an action roll. So on a success with hope, you pull it off well and you get what you want, and you take a hope token. On a success with fear, you get what you want, but it comes with a cost or a consequence. On a failure with hope, things don't go to plan. You probably don't get what you want and must face the consequence. Take a hope. On a failure with fear, things go very poorly. You probably don't get what you want and there is a major consequence or complication. Plus, if you get a critical success, which is when you roll the same number on both d12s, regardless of the number, you get what you want and a little extra, take a hope and clear a stress. If you made an attack roll, you'll also deal extra damage. Okay, I don't know why, but this really stressed me out as the GM because I felt like for every roll, I had to keep in mind 5 different consequences that could happen at any given time. And that could just be me overthinking it. But yeah, every roll I was like, okay, all right, so success with hope, you pull it off, you get, okay, take a hope. Okay, a failure with hope, what do I do? Yeah, I think when I'm running a D&D game, I can just intuit fairly easily how to scale up or down the success or failure of something based on where the dice lands because I've been playing it for so many years now. But with this game, it still doesn't feel intuitive to me, particularly the succeed with fear, because I didn't want to undermine the success of the player, but then I still had to think of some kind of narrative reason that there was fear there. And there's actually a particular section in the manuscript that warns GMs about undermining the success when they succeed with fear. So that felt just a little bit stressful and overwhelming to me. I am sure I will get better at this as I play the game more, but I generally think that this area needs a little bit more refinement to make it a little less overwhelming, especially for new GMs. So when the players gain hope, they can use it to power their specific domain abilities, which I think makes a lot of sense and seems fairly easy to follow. I haven't actually played as a player yet, so that's just kind of my impression watching my players interact with their abilities. Oh, and as an aside about those abilities, I love that they refresh per session rather than per long rest, or at least some of them do, because yeah, let me do my cool thing every session rather than always having to wait for a rest. Sometimes you don't get a rest for a few sessions if you're deep into something. So I really enjoyed that aspect. But when the GM gets fear, what can they do with it? Well, let's look at the list. I printed out the entire manuscript so that I could make notes, but it's so unorganized now and I'm just like, where is everything? Okay, I think I got it. So when you spend fear, you can do something big. You can
pick a countdown. Use an adversary's fear move, take advantage on a roll, end an effect, clear a condition, add an additional d6 damage, add 2 tokens to the action tracker, interrupt the PCs to take an action with 2 fear.
Most of the things on here make sense to me and are fairly easy to work into the game as you go, but I want to talk about this first point right here. Do something big. Do something big. What does this mean? Reading on, the manuscript says, you can always spend fear to make something particularly exciting, dangerous, and narratively impactful happen in the scene. This is especially useful when you're improvising an enemy or an environment on the spot and you don't have any established moves to pull from. You can just do a cool thing. This is honestly very confusing to me. As the GM, it is a big part of our role to introduce tension and drama and challenges to be overcome. And I don't know, it just doesn't make sense to me to have to spend a mechanical resource to do so. If I plan to do something huge and exciting in the game, but I don't have much fear to spend, do I just have to sort of string things along until the players have rolled poorly enough times? If I have a good idea in the moment that makes sense for the narrative, but I don't have much fear, should I not use that idea? I don't know, I just really don't think the game needs do something big as a use for fear. Maybe fear should just stay something that powers things in combat. It's like a mechanical thing. It makes sense to me that if the players end up fighting something unexpected that I don't have a stat block for, I might use fear to do something cool, or maybe if they're in a social encounter, I have a really intimidating NPC, I might use fear to get advantage on a roll to intimidate the group. That makes sense to me, it's like a mechanical thing, but I think just this catch-all do something big is unnecessary and kind of unhelpful. I also wonder what impact requiring fear to power adversaries or making big narrative moves is going to have on the overall flow of both a session and a campaign. I worry that every session will sort of start to feel similar if a GM has to allow for a build-up of fear before initiating a combat or a big narrative move. Fear is generated fairly frequently, so my fear could end up being unfounded, and I am hoping I can play it in a longer game of like a few more sessions so I can sort of see how that plays out. Daggerheart does not have an initiative system, but instead the players go in any order they like. Whenever someone makes a roll, they place a token on an action tracker. The players keep taking turns until one of them misses an attack or rolls with fear. When that happens, the turn moves to the GM, who can then use the tokens on the action tracker to activate the adversary's abilities. Once the GM has run out of tokens or chooses to end their turn, the round then moves back to the players, who again go in any order that they like. In my first 2 games, I had a really fantastic experience with this. It was my favorite part of the game. It made for a narrative flow that felt much more interesting, and I noticed that it encouraged the players to think outside the box a little bit more. They got creative with the environment around them rather than purely focusing on their domain abilities, and they also worked together rather than just waiting for their turn to roll around. I do think that a no initiative system could be problematic for groups who have difficulty sharing the spotlight, and particularly for quieter players who may not have the confidence to jump in and do something. I think a really simple fix for that though, which I hope they do add, is an optional rule where anyone can go in any order, but you can't take another turn until everybody has had a turn. Haha, surprise, yesterday they just announced in the update they are indeed implementing this rule. I believe it is you can add 3 action tokens to like your character sheet, and once you've spent all 3, you have to have waited for everyone else to take a turn or use up all their tokens before you can do anything else. So yes, kudos to that. I think it's a great optional rule. I think it was really helpful and needed. But yes, it may add a bit of extra work for the GM in managing the flow and making sure that everyone gets a moment to shine in the spotlight. I had a great time with the no initiative system in my first 2 sessions, but in my 3rd session, however, the experience was very different, which purely came down to the luck of the dice. I was running the Veil encounter from the Quick Start adventure, which requires the players to take down a certain number of enemies, in this case 8, to end the encounter successfully. And my players, they just kept missing their attacks. I was rolling in so much fear and finding it really hard to keep the pace of the combat going because my dudes just kept hitting and the players were not. The play passed back to me every 2 or 3 rolls, and in some cases after just a single roll. Because I had banked up a lot of fear prior to the encounter in preparation for it, I had a lot to work with to generate more actions for myself. Now, the players rolling poorly is no fault of Daggerheart. In any game, the luck can turn against the players, and it absolutely sucks. But the thing I struggled with in Daggerheart, or especially in this particular encounter, is adjusting the kind of levers of the combat. This is a concept I learned about from Sly Flourish, whose videos I highly recommend. But he talks about a few levers or sliders that you can use to scale up or down certain things to keep the pacing of a combat fun and exciting. One example of that is moving an enemy's hit points up or down. Still within the hit point range of the stat block, but if your players are hitting something too hard, you might slide those hit points up a bit, but if the fight is dragging on, you might slide those hit points down. I just didn't feel like I had as much control over that stuff in Daggerheart because the hit point system works really differently to D&D, and plus because this particular encounter used a countdown die and the players knew they had to take down 8 enemies before the ritual was over, there was no way for me to say, oh, actually, you only needed to take down 4, when combat started to lag. While there are a lot of things I really like about the combat system, I ultimately feel that in some ways it's trying a bit too hard to be both rules light and crunchy. The Fear and Hope tokens add a mechanical crunch, but then the monster stat blocks are very sparse and the narrative flow of combat is a lot more loosey-goosey. In Daggerheart, rather than a PC losing hit points when an attack reaches their armor class, it has 3 factors that determine whether they lose hit points. It has their evasion, which is their ability to dodge out of the way. It has their armor, which the player can choose to expend a slot of to reduce the incoming damage. And then they have a damage threshold, which determines how many hit points they lose. For GMs, this is slightly simplified. Instead of evasion and armor, they just have one number called difficulty, which determines if an attack lands. Whilst these 3 factors do seem kind of complicated, I actually really enjoyed the different narrative options it gives you. With evasion, you can describe how you ducked out of the way. By spending an armor slot, you can talk about how the attack, crushed in the middle of your breastplate, but you're still going. And then by taking damage, you can describe how the character reacts to physical pain. Plus, as a GM, it was much simpler marking off 3 to 5 hit points rather than thinking in the tens or, even hundreds. One change I would make though is to call the hit points wounds, because the idea that you can take, 4 or 5 wounds before you're either unconscious or dying makes more sense to me than 5 hit points worth of damage. Oh, and speaking of dying, there is another part of the game I really like, and that is the death moves. If your character loses all 3 hit points, rather than outright dying or making death saves like you would in D&D, the player can choose from 3 options. I'm a huge fan of giving a player agency when it comes to the death of a character, and in fact, it was quite a while ago now, but I made a video talking about how to do that in your D&D games, so I was really thrilled to see these death moves. We actually had the opportunity to try it out because one of my PCs did lose all their hit points. The player chose option 3, risk it all, and they rolled with hope, so they came back in the game, and it was like a really fun and exciting moment. Something that I think Daggerheart does really well is onboard new players. The sidecar feature is genius. Like, the way it works is you have 2 sheets of paper, one goes underneath your character sheet, and if you want to know what something on the character sheet means or, does, you simply slide the bottom sheet either to the left or the right, and it has an explanation block with an arrow pointing to the relevant section. This is just so clever. Whoever designed this over at Darrington Press, here, I tip my hat to you. You deserve your flowers. The character creation in general is just really fun and easy, and it's brilliant that the game encourages you to only play with 1 card of each domain ability so that no one ends up with the same ability twice. Personally, I think there's nothing more demoralizing than when you build a really cool character with like a specific ability and you get all excited to use it, and then it turns out someone else in the party is like, oh yeah, I got that too. Here, I'm gonna do it instead. And you're like, okay. So yes, different domain abilities, I'm very excited about that. I also just think the Quick Start Adventure is really good for people who've never run a game before. It gives you explicit directions about when to do things and examples of how you can make rulings for particular action roles. It was incredibly easy to follow with just 1 read through before I ran it. I also think the manuscript itself does contain some really great advice for new game masters. Something I noted though in the game is that it is constantly reminding you that you don't need to follow the rules. You can always change things. And honestly, I got a little bit frustrated with it because the whole point for me of buying a rules book is to learn the rules of the game. I do think it's important to let new game masters know that they can always tweak things, but I don't think it needs to be said as many times as it is in the book. This hasn't seen an editor yet, so I imagine once it is edited by someone, that might get tidied up and scaled back a bit because it just is a little bit repetitive. And at times I was just like, when it's, okay, you can do whatever you want. I was like, well then why are you telling me the rules? So I would like to see it stick a little bit more to its guns in terms of the rulings. Overall, I am really excited to see the development of Daggerheart and where the finished product is going to end. I think it has a really strong foundation, and while there are some things about it I don't love, I think they seem really eager to hear community feedback and sort of take that on board. So yes, I will of course be submitting my feedback directly to the Daggerheart playtest surveys, which I encourage everybody to do if you have read or played the game and you have opinions. I know there are tons of things that I didn't touch on in this video, but it's a big game and I have only played it a handful of times. These are just kind of my first impressions. I was sort of jotting down notes as we were going. And I'm sure as I play more sessions, I will get used to parts of the games that I didn't quite gel with, and I'll discover more things that I like and that I don't like. If you've played or read Daggerheart, I would love to hear what you thought about it in the comments. And we also have a Daggerheart channel in my Discord where we can chat about the game. So if you want to jump in there and get nerdy with people, there is a link in the description. If you want to check out my first time running the game, you can see my one-shot with GM Workshop, X Clementine, and Matt Brown right here. Just be nice about the mistakes that I made. Okay,